Good afternoon, everybody. I think that we will go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the closing plenary session of the Climate Action 2016 Forum. My name is Christina Bowman. I'm a second-year Master's Public Policy student here at the University of Maryland. I was part of the University of Maryland's graduate student delegation to the Paris COP, and it is my privilege to be this panel's moderator this afternoon. So we've had just an amazing day of climate action here today, and just amazing speakers and amazing energy, and I can't think of a better way to close out the day than in a conversation on climate action with today and tomorrow's leaders. So it is my honor to introduce our panel. We have Kaya Chatterjee, the Executive Director of the U.S. Climate Action Network, author of the Zero Footprint Baby, and one of the leading climate activists in the area. And we have Martin O'Malley, the 61st Governor of the state of Maryland.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
One of the leading most vocal state leaders on climate change, and really responsible for injecting climate change to the front of the presidential election. We have Niraj Pasule, a first-year School of Public Policy master's student with a focus on energy policy, and Isabella Berenga, a undergraduate public health science major and the founder of the United Nations Foundation Association chapter here at the University of Maryland. So I'm very pleased to welcome everybody here, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
So there are different ways that people think about the challenge of climate change and how to best go about solving it. So I was hoping that you could share with us, what does climate action mean to you? What's your vision for climate action?
Who goes first?
We can start with you, Kaya.
Great. So thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. So for me, climate change is an issue that's completely changed both my career and my life. In my career, at U.S. Climate Action Network, I'm really focused on making sure that civil society has a voice. And I think that's actually more important now than ever coming out of the Paris Climate Agreement, because we just agreed to this really, really important step forward that's bottom up. And so we really need civil society to hold governments accountable. So I think that in my career, what I do is incredibly important in trying to bring some alignment among the civil rights groups, immigration rights groups, faith groups, environmental groups that are working on this issue. And then in my life, it's just completely changed everything about my life. In a moment of customer service rage at Pepco, probably shouldn't admit this in big public settings, I cut off my electricity quite a few years back, and I've been on this pretty steady trajectory of figuring out how in my personal life I can just get off of fossil fuels and live in that future that all my member organizations are really trying to move forward. And I find that in my personal life, it's an issue I think about pretty much every day. But, as a person with a 5-year-old, I feel like it's just fundamentally a core part of my job as a parent to make sure that he's safe, and that means running out of here right afterwards and being at the school meeting about that they found lead in the water, but it also means making sure that there's a stable climate so that we have food and water availability, and we're he's growing up in a world where he can actually think about having a kid. So I would say climate change is a fundamental framing issue both in my personal life and in my career.
And you, Governor O'Malley?
Climate action. I think for me, it's about, climate action, I don't want to define something by the term itself, but I'm going to. It's really about taking the action. And a protest is not an action. Awareness is not an action. Going to meetings, I guess that's sort of an action. But actually to do the things on land, and as the surface dwellers that we are, that actually contribute to and move us to a point where we're drawing more carbon out of the atmosphere every year than we're pumping into it. That's the key. And what I found in my tour of duty in city government and state government as an elected executive is that small things done well make bigger things possible. And today we have the ability to map and measure those very impactful human actions in such a way that we can actually inspire people, encourage people, and support a growing and stronger consensus to take even stronger actions. And that's a very, very exciting point we find ourselves on in our evolution.
Yeah, absolutely. What about you, Niraj?
Well, I think so far what we have achieved is trying to remove skepticism around climate science. And for me, climate action is removing skepticism around climate implementation. Proving that there are models that can be replicated, that can be scaled up. And that one of the part would be meeting the INDCs that have been proposed, helping those countries reach that. Not just because we're morally obligated to do that through the Paris Agreement, because if we don't do that, the entire civil society or the common people would lose belief on the work that we have been doing so far. So my experience in India, I had volunteered in installing solar home systems in villages that are disconnected from the grid. And I remember in one visit, our group was literally worshipped by the people. And that surprised me a lot, that how much it means to them to get access to electricity. I've seen a boy just jumping, a 6-year-old boy jumping on his rooftop with joy and placing the panel on top. And that joy, that motivates me to work. You know, I want to give that joy to all those millions around. That's my vision.
Cool.
Well, I guess for me, when I consider climate change, I think my goal is to try and simplify the issue, because I think every person has an ability to make an impact, but we fail to realize that. I first became involved with, climate change when I joined the SGA in high school, and just being involved with different sustainable initiatives. And sometimes it's very discouraging when you see on the news what's going on as far as fossil fuels and emissions. And it can be difficult to think that one person has the actual ability to make an impact. So I think it's important to really encourage community engagement and thinking about not the issue like the results you're going to see at a global scale, but what can you do in your community? What can you do in your house? Whether it's like recycling, using more energy efficient sources, carpooling to work. I think just those little actions, if every person is involved, that's what's going to make a big impact. So I think it's just being involved in your community and inspiring others to get involved and take action towards this issue.
And Niraj, I think you touched on this a little bit in terms of your motivation for wanting to act on climate. So you've done a lot of work in India on energy policy, and you've stayed really involved in climate action here on campus at the University of Maryland, especially in providing educational platforms for other students. You touched on what motivates you, but could you expand on that a little bit more and talk about how do students really find initiatives and link up with other students to act on climate? And Isabella, in starting your own UNF association chapter here, how do you appeal to students of different disciplines and kind of mobilize them? You spoke a little bit about community engagement. Maybe you can both just share some advice for other students who want to get involved.
Absolutely. Okay, that's great. So yeah, thank you for that. So I founded the United Nations Association chapter here at Maryland. So we're a very new chapter, it's been our first semester, and definitely trying to engage the students was definitely not easy at first, because when they hear United Nations, they think of this massive organization and how can they get involved, and I think they think of model UN or government majors. So it definitely was a process to try to appeal to students from all different kind of backgrounds. I think what's been helpful is the initiative of the Sustainable Development Goals, which are an extension of the Millennium Development Goals at the United Nations, which are 17 global targets that UN member states are trying to achieve. And I really think that what's been great is that the UN has been really promoting youth engagement as a very important part of this process to achieve the goals, because we're the next generation responsible for protecting our planet, and therefore it's important that we're not just considering being leaders of the future, but being leaders today who can take action at the university level. So when talking to students about joining my group, I would just ask, well, what's something you care about? What's an issue you're passionate about? And I'm certain that one of like the 17 goals is something you care about, whether it's hunger, gender equality, or climate action. So it's been really nice to see that we have students who are bio majors, computer science majors, and it's really great to see them get involved and want to make an impact and see the relationship they have. Maybe they don't see themselves at the UM, but actually you do have actual power. Your voice is powerful, and just showing that, when we have a diverse group of students that come to our meetings, I think that's what's really powerful, because we have different things to offer, addressing different issues. And one real big goal of our chapter is not just to educate and advocate on behalf of UM, but we're going to be discussing these global issues and also giving students the opportunity outside the classroom, outside the university, to get involved, whether we have our lobby days where we get to go on Capitol Hill and meet with your representative and being able to tell your congressman or congresswoman, I care about this issue and this is why I want to do something about it. I think that's really powerful. So it's just about bridging the connection between students and also the local and government level.
Absolutely.
Well, I think you should exactly do what Isabella has done. Well, to sum up, but I would say that just have 3 E's. Basically, that's empathize, engage, and execute. So empathize on whatever cause that you feel that you strongly care about. If you care about that cause, then go and approach your faculties or groups like the Environmental Council at the School of Public Policy in searching for initiatives that they can that you can work on, and then be sure on building your idea to a point that it would be executable. So my vision for climate action, as I said, was for implementation, and I've been trying to research on models of implementation. And I should call out Professor Hultman and Professor Patwardhan if he's here. I've been pestering them so much that I think if I knock their door once again, they would get mad at me. So yeah. So be patient and persistent in your objective, and I think you would be able to find a lot of resources to engage with.
Absolutely. Great. Governor O'Malley, you have been really vocal about climate change, very vocal about climate change on the state and the national level. So millennials care about climate change. We believe that this is the defining issue of our generation, and so that resonates with us. Like we get it. But what are some of the key messages that you've shared with all generations? Could you share some of those messages with us? Like what's resonated with your audiences?
Yeah, and one that I'm going to start using, I'm going to steal your empathize, engage, and execute.
Sure.
I looked at Dean Orr, I'm like, that's pretty good. We're folk singers. Right. I'm a folk singer, not a composer. But when I hear a good song, this is what I found is all across our country, when I would say this phrase, that climate change is the greatest business opportunity to come to the United States of America in 100 years, people would applaud. And I think the key to that phrase is that rather than wrapping this issue in the framework of less than, we need to tell the story in the narrative of that it's going to be a future with more prosperity, more health, more opportunity, and that's the key. I think we have, my friend, I'd recently joined this terrific network of people led by Paul Hawken called Project Drawdown that's all about mapping and measuring the 100 most impactful actions that we can take. And by the way, I want to also acknowledge that we're joined here by Treasurer Nancy Kopp of the great state of Maryland, who's a fearless climate action advocate. And but it's important that we wrap this in the prosperity framework. That's, I think, really the key. And that's what I found makes it resonate all around the country, across all generations. And that's the key.
Kaya, you are a leading climate activist, and you were involved in the People's Climate March in 2014. So how do you appeal to so many people that have maybe disparate issues or interests, and how do you unite them under a common thread, under a common goal that's climate action?
Sure. Well, I think I probably agree with Governor O'Malley on almost everything, except that I think protests do matter. So a protest is an action. I think that one of the things that I'm always looking at is like, how does really big social change occur? And I've not seen a historical example of really big social change, whether it's the women's voting rights movement, or whether it's ending the Vietnam War, or whether it's the civil rights movement, where you didn't put people in the streets. That's a part of every big movement. And we're talking about doing something really big here when we're talking about acting on climate change. So we actually, I look across my membership and I say we need three things. We need an activist base. Every movement's had that. We need to have the permissive majority with us, which we have right now. The majority of the country's with us, and it really resonates for them when we talk about opportunities. It really resonates for them when we have validators from the business community talking to them about the opportunities here. And we need to keep them with us. And sometimes, to be honest, the activist base turns them off. And so we really need to make an extra effort to keep those people engaged, and then we need to have political leadership. A moment like the People's Climate March was a moment to bring all of that together. We invited everybody. We made it open source. We made it so that everybody could feel like it was their moment. It was their march. They owned it, because there really was no centralized leadership. Like I was in a documentary that people could use to recruit participation, but there was no one in charge. It was a place.
You were in charge.
I was not in charge. I was really not. And that was the key to making that happen. Wow.
We're saving energy. We're using energy.
Yeah, so I mean, and I think that we really exceeded all of our expectations in terms of numbers there, and I think that's because people really resonated with the idea of there being a moral obligation. People really resonated with what Neeraj and Isabella were talking about in terms of like, this is an exciting opportunity, and lots of people from different sectors can come together. And I think people also understood that we needed to come together, because I want to be honest, like there are people who don't want this to happen. We've been all talking, very happily about how fun and awesome it is, but it hasn't happened yet, not because it doesn't make sense, and not because it doesn't make economic sense, not because it doesn't make moral sense, but because there are people who don't want it to happen. And so, I started my career at NASA at a point where there was a person from ExxonMobil, Phil Cooney, working in the White House editing all the science documents. The problem wasn't that he didn't have access to the science. He had so much access to the science, he was able to edit it. The problem was that he didn't want to believe it. He chose a set of facts in advance of seeing that. And so I think that it's important for us to realize there's a very, very small set of people who don't want us to proceed in this direction, but they're pretty small. I mean, we're actually winning right now. I believe that we will win, and I believe we are winning. The most recent data from Yale showed us that we are only increasing the number of Republicans who care about this issue, even as we build our activist base. That's what winning looks like. Our emissions trajectories are heading the right way. That's what winning looks like.
Yeah.
And to that end, may I point out that we're joined by the head of the college Republicans. Thank you very much.
I just made this up, but I think protests are like alarm clock for a government. You need them. It's not that you don't need them to wake up for them to wake up, but you need them to wake up on time. And you can keep on snoozing them, but at some point you have to just wake up.
Fair point. I stand corrected on protests. Protests are actions.
Well, at this point, I'd love to open up this panel for some dialogue, and we can exchange some questions. And if there's time, we will take some questions from the audience as well.
Sure. Just to follow up with Mr. O'Malley and Ms. Carrigy, so what are some of the best practices and lessons learned that you have from community engagement and, in addressing climate action?
So start where people are, send the right person. I think this is something that the social science community has really contributed quite a lot of research in, which is that if you send someone into a community that is not from that community and try and talk to them, it's much less effective than if you choose a person who's already a leader in that community and help them have the tools and abilities to engage in their own community. I really believe very, very, very strongly that our leadership must come from the grassroots. And that's part of why I took the job that I'm in, because I believe that we already know that it's low-income communities and communities of color that are hit first and worst by the impacts of climate change and are most proximate to the impacts from fossil fuels. And I really believe that giving those communities an opportunity to show leadership is critical. And so I really, I think that we need to make sure that we're listening to the leadership that comes from those communities and building that leadership up. And that's my biggest lesson in building up a base of people who care about this issue, is making sure to give that leadership to the communities.
If I've stumbled upon a best practice, if you will, I believe that one of the biggest impediments that we have to taking the actions with the speed with which that's required is a lack of trust in one another. And it has been my experience that that when you actually not just declare the goal, but also itemize the leading actions that drive you to goal, and have the guts to measure those actions, whether you're hitting them or whether you're falling short, that instills greater trust. Another way to think about it is it's very, very important that we create a compelling scoreboard that everyone can see. Otherwise, we tend to fall into the abyss of, well, I bet nobody else is holding up their end, so why should I hold up mine? But we've never had a better tool than in this day and age with the internet to engage in our nation's context, 320 million eyeballs on the page to see that we actually are doing what we're doing. And I think that there's a tremendous power in leaders that have the humility to measure performance openly, including those instances where they fall short. We fall short.
I would like to ask a question as well. Many of the aspects of climate implementation are not quantified fully yet. But we still know intuitively that we need to act upon those. So how do you think you should convince fellow policymakers or other stakeholders to look beyond numbers and economics?
You mean the model debates?
Many of the modeling or some aspects are still not quantified. Some financial things are not clear yet. So, but still, we need to act. We need to implement. How do you convince people?
I think on the big score, I find. I'm sorry.
Okay.
This is analogous to many of the debates that we had over cleaning up the waters of the Chesapeake Bay. I think we could all agree that the Chesapeake's waters are degraded by human activity on land, and that the Chesapeake's waters are only going to become healthier if we take a different suite of actions on the land. And what I would share with fellow governors, David Costello can tell you, who was at some of these meetings, when they wanted to have a never-ending debate about what we don't know for sure in the model, I would bring it back to the actions. In other words, look, we can debate till the cows come home, and let's hope when they come home they don't cross the stream or stand in it. We can debate till the cows come home, the aspects of the model, but this is one thing that we can't debate. If you're doing fewer acres in cover crops this year than you were last year, that's a graph moving in the wrong direction. And if you're doing more acres in cover crops this year than you were last year, that's a graph that's moving in the right direction. So, whatever about the model, and I'm not a scientist, I can tell you this. Here's our 36 things that we're doing in Maryland, Virginia. What have you done since last year on these 36 things? And that brings it back to a much more actionable agenda. And I think the same is true in this context. There's certain things we know, regardless of, you can be even a climate denier if you like, but there are certain things that will make your air healthier, right? There are certain things that will make your economy stronger and better. A gentleman earlier asked me, how did you get the renewable portfolio standard passed in Maryland? And it was you, right? And I said, well, we framed it as prosperity, and what we said was, look, in our innovation, in Maryland's strong innovation economy, we're being left behind in the development of green jobs. If you look where we rank in creating these new jobs of an emerging sector, we're way down here. And look at Massachusetts up there and California up there. We want to create more jobs, so that's why this renewable portfolio standard is important. None of those states that are creating the new green jobs did it without having a renewable portfolio standard. We need to move ours up from whatever it was, 7% 8 years ago, now it's 20. And then recently, even under a Republican governor, the legislature raised it to 25%. So I hope that kind of answers the question.
I think we need some leader like that in Mississippi. I was there like for 4 years, and I was so concerned that there's no renewable portfolio standard whatsoever. I think
the South is tough.
Yeah.
The South is tough right now.
I mean, and then on the other hand, the South it has massive inequality. It's where a lot of the coal is. It's also where the civil rights movement came from, and where a lot of activists were born. And so we're actually seeing a lot of action in the South. And there's a new governor in Louisiana, and I think that it's an area where we need to focus in this country, and we need to redouble our efforts, because there's a lot of coal there, there's a lot of inequality, and there's a lot of people there's a lot of impacts of climate change. If you look at communities along the Gulf South, there are these mix of like community, Black communities, Vietnamese fisher people, indigenous communities that are losing their land, that are having to be moved, that got slammed by Katrina, and then 5 years later slammed by a BP oil spill, and are not interested in taking it anymore. And so, we have these moments that we need to take advantage of and organize and turn into political action whenever they occur. And I think that the South is a place that's just ripe for doing that.
Yeah, and I saw in just the interactions of the 50 men and women that are the nation's governors, that the increasingly frequent and ever more violent storm events have made converts out of a lot of governors in states that in the past, and recent past, like just a term or two ago, would have been climate deniers.
Yeah.
They're not denying anymore. Not in Oklahoma, no? Not in Louisiana.
Well, I have a question for Niraj. It was so inspiring to hear about your experience in India. So what are some barriers that you think that less developed countries face when trying to address climate action?
I think even this has been discussed at the forum as well, especially in the luncheon, that I think mobilization of finances and institution building is probably the key tough points that LDCs face. But we sometimes underestimate the capacity of LDCs. For example, let's take Bangladesh. It's a low-income country, yet it deploys about 80,000 solar home systems in a month.
Yeah.
In a month, and I'm not kidding.
That's great.
And has as many solar homes as the United States.
Exactly. That's about 4 to 5 million people getting electricity in an year. And compare that with what sub-Saharan Africa has. It has about 50 countries which have an average about 13 million population which does not have electricity. 5 million per year, 13 million per nation. You can do that in 3 to 4 years if you make those countries reach that capacity and reach that institution level that Bangladesh has. It's possible.
Definitely.
So Kaya, I was wondering, in your work, I mean, we're talking about, taking action, goals, how do we get there? How do we mobilize? In your experience, what are some of the most powerful incentives to individuals in affecting change and motivating them and even on the individual level and then higher and higher and higher, like what are the motivators for change?
Yeah. So I think, unfortunately for us, they're different for different people, which makes it hard. But the good news is that you know what that motivator is for your friends and family, which means that you have the power to go to your friends and family and talk about it. And I think the most powerful motivator is for people to talk about their personal story. And so I've often thought if we could have a Thanksgiving where everybody goes home and says something like, gosh, I'm thankful that, that we didn't have another Sandy this year because I really worry about the impacts of climate change. Or gosh, I'm thankful that we are finally heading the right direction on emissions because I can't decide whether or not to have another kid or to have a kid at all based on, I think if we really made personal appeals to our friends and family, it would be motivating. And then, I think I always say in your life, there's 3 areas where you can move people. Usually it's not climate related things that make people make those changes, but for some people it is, for me, I literally got mad at Pepco. That's why I got solar panels. It varies from person to person. But then once I started thinking about it as a climate change issue, I will say that's what led to the scale of changes that we made in our own household. So the 3 big areas we focused on were, in our home, electricity, our mobility, and our food. Those are the 3 key areas. And we said, okay, well, in our home, if we install solar panels and we really work on being able to live within the bounds of those panels, that takes care of electricity. People, what we found recently is that solar power is actually contagious. Like if it's I love the joy of solar thing because if it's a disease, I want to catch it, right? It's an awesome one.
Yeah.
And it's contagious. If you do it, other people will do it. And so electricity, mobility, I live in a transit-oriented place. I'm able to do that because of investments of people like Governor O'Malley. We sold our car when we started making this commitment to reduce our carbon footprint because I could, right? I can get around by bike and by public transit. And then on food, some of this stuff is just such a no-brainer, right? We throw away 30 to 50% of the food that we produce in this country. That's just insane and wasteful, and our grandparents would be, so mad at us for this. And that's just fully within our power to do something about it. And why don't people do it? I think people do what's fun, easy, and popular. That's what the research tells us. So whatever you're doing in campaign, make it fun, make it easy, make it popular, they will do it.
Well, climate action is fun, interesting, and popular here at the University of Maryland.
Interesting, easy. Fun, easy, and popular.
Well, I think that we can open it up for some audience Q&A at this point. There are some mic wranglers in the audience somewhere, and
Mike Wrangler.
I'll ask a question of you guys in the meantime.
Oh,
One of the
yeah,
things
please.
that motivated my experience of being pregnant and having a child, was monumental and changing for me in my perspective of the issue, because when I started looking at projections for 2050, it was then like, oh my God, when my son's going to be 40. And it was very hard for me to read that. And I wonder, as young people who've been doing so much on this, how do you think about that issue? And do you think about this question of whether or not to have kids as you've gotten more into the data and understood the impacts of climate change?
I think as long as we inculcate the same values that we are following into our kids, I think they would be 10 times better than us to implement climate action. That's what I'll say.
I'll be honest, I guess I'm not thinking as far as kids, that kind of scale yet, I'll be honest. But
I'm sure your parents
Even
would be
I
happy
just
about
thought
that.
yeah, they're here, so they're probably but I guess for me, it's more they understand that the actions I take today, I'm not going to see the results tomorrow or the next couple of years. I understand that, when we fight for these initiatives, it's not about oh, I want to take recognition for doing this and solving this. Like, that's not the goal of what we do. The goal is that we can inspire future generations to continue this movement, because we'll probably see the effects of our work maybe, like 100 years from now or more or less. And so I think more of that large scale, and just hope that the actions I do today, maybe I won't see like the impacts yet, but if it just creates, encourage, and as you said, it's an infectious movement, just get people involved, I would hope that we can really see the large scale effects, because I do care about the future generation, the life that they're gonna have, and the effects are irreversible, so it's very important that we take a stance now.
Governor O'Malley, you're too nice. And I have a question for you. I'm wondering if you could name, please, specifically, 3 politicians that we need to fire in order to develop offshore wind energy in Maryland, and the specific reasons why we need to fire those people. And I'd like the rest of the panel to answer the question of what qualities we need to look for in the people that we hire to replace them. And I would like nobody on the panel to resort to any recent training that they might have about answering a different question when asked a question that they might not necessarily wish to answer specifically.
Oh, man. Well, look, I worked hard for our party's nominee, Lieutenant Governor Anthony Brown, who's now, hopefully, in the fall, depending on what the people decide, has a real good shot at being Congressman Brown, because we had put together a lot of things in our energy policies in Maryland, including offshore wind, that I was hopeful he would be able to carry the ball down the field and get done. So that was the choice I made in the last election, but other people made different choices. How's that? Was that diplomatic? Kinda? You want 2 more? 2 more. Well, there's a governor and there's a lieutenant governor. I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to go there. Nancy Kopp, though, I think, is a great advocate at the state for offshore wind. I don't know where the comptroller is on this. Where's the comptroller? Wishy-washy? Nancy, you want to answer this question? She's in the arena now. All right, I think we're going to go to the next question.
So political leadership is so important, right? It's one of the 3 things I listed. Like, you've got to have the activist base, you have to have the permissive majority, but then you actually have to have a political leader who's going to do something with that. And it's really hard to know sometimes unless you ask them. And so I would say the first thing that everyone needs to do is go and ask people. We so often are voting for people at all levels of government without asking them these key questions. What are you actually going to do to lower emissions, and at what scale, and how high of a priority is it for you? What are you going to do about offshore wind? We don't ask these questions often enough in enough public settings that people feel accountable for it. And and there's some mystery to me about political leadership, to be honest. If you look at the arc of President Obama's presidency, I would argue there was 6 years when I wasn't thrilled, and then 2 years when I was. So what was the difference? Was the arc of the presidency just that way, and there was nothing we could do about it, right? Like, he just was going to try and work with Congress first, and then finally have his, what rhymes with a bucket list? And there's nothing we could do, or was, it's his joke, not mine. Or is getting people like John Podesta appointed something we can do as civil society to have someone in the ear all the time? Or was it really about getting the youth? Was it really about getting Sasha and Malia on board to pester him? Because no one else is in a position to pester him every day, right? And so, I think these are key questions. Voting is a piece of it. Voting on the issue, raising the issue all the time, knowing where people stand when you're going to vote on them, but then also figuring out the inside game of how do you make sure once they're elected that they're going to do what it is you want them to do, and you've got to continue to do direct action and inside action and push at every turn.
Can I come back around to your thing, though, and answer it possibly in a different way? There, so far, has been absolutely no political repercussions whatsoever for unplugging what used to be a publicly facing dashboard that allowed every citizen to see whether or not we were taking the leading actions to hit our climate change goals, and whether or not we were taking the leading actions on other things like reducing nitrogen sediment and phosphorus flow into the bay. That was unplugged with the new administration. And the outcry, you could hear crickets.
Are you saying there should have been a protest, Governor?
I'm saying that, yeah, I'm with you. Yeah. Yes. I'm saying there should have been a protest. I've been converted. Yeah, you could have heard crickets from otherwise informed people. Those dashboards no longer exist. They were unplugged with the new administration. And in many instances, we're still doing some of those things. But boy, man, you have to be a pretty dedicated researcher to dive into page 37 of the climate reduction plan to find that graph that used to be right there on the front page for every citizen to see. So I think part of this is that we need to exercise our power as citizens to insist on a level of not just data. Open data is fine, that's great, but open data is not the same thing as information. And we need to have an executive view of citizens the same and equal to the executive view that a committed governor or mayor would have to accomplishing these goals.
I think we have one question here and then one more over there.
Hi. My name is. My name is Luis Aragon. I'm an engineer and an energy economist from Colorado School of Mines. And before I ask my question, I would like to caution the panel on dissing against the South with regards to climate action, and remind y'all that Texas is leading the way in renewable generation. It exceeded its renewable portfolio standard years ahead of it.
True.
And close to 15 to 20% of its generation is from wind energy.
Good point.
A traditionally red state pro-fossil fuel economy, still, they're not mutually exclusive.
Right.
And my question to the panel is kind of an open question. I'm curious to see if you could address the elephant in the room with regards to climate change. There's this movie called Cowspiracy, which I'm sure most or some of you are familiar with it. And it addresses the fact that industrial agriculture is really, and at the sounding provocative, it's really easy to jump on the bandwagon and diss on the fossil fuel companies and oil and gas and all of this. But when you look at the numbers, whether it's the land that's used for agriculture or the forest and jungle and rainforest that is deforested so you can raise crops to feed cows, or whether it's the water that is wasted or that goes into making 1 pound of meat. This seems to be the pressing issue, that the economy and the diet habits that we've come to taken for granted, it's really generating a lot of stress into the environment. And I hate to sound like the hipster friend that tells you you should be vegan and all of that. I'm not vegan, I love meat. But still, like watching that movie kind of, it made sense. And I think it's important to address that, especially as other developing nations are pursuing more the Western type of life, which involves, going to TGI Fridays often and ordering ribs and whatnot. So it's just my question to the panel is, are you concerned that in an event of such a high profile such as this one, the issue of industrial agriculture wasn't really brought up to the way it could have been?
I thought we had a couple breakouts on agriculture and land. And with my involvement with Project Drawdown, one of the things Paul Hawken told me just a few weeks ago is that we've identified that 40% of the most impactful actions involve agriculture and land use. So I think there's a growing awareness of that. I do think that, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to expand that.
I actually can relate to that very well. I probably 2 to 3 weeks back, I attended a post-panel Paris panel in the atrium of School of Public Policy, and somewhere in between, I think you mentioned, Dinor mentioned, or somebody mentioned about, reducing consumption of livestock, and that like was a clicking point for me. I had never thought of it that it would have such a high impact, and then I Googled and saw Cowspiracy and stuff. Next day, I quit meat. So, I pledged to that. I posted on Facebook. I think Christina saw that. But that was much easier for me because I was born and brought up as a vegetarian in India. My parents don't eat meat. But then I later on shifted, okay, I can try meat, it's tasty and stuff like that. But now I won't. But I understand how hard it is for people to shift to that diet. I cannot go vegan because milk is so essential for me. I like my chai, Indian chai, so. But I might eventually do that. So I think, but even if you can't go complete vegetarian, I think you can do something like, I'll eat meat for like twice a week. Sorry, twice a week. That would eventually reduce the demand for it as well, and you can contribute it. Why not? Start from there.
I think we have time for one more audience question.
I want to thank the panelists for joining us today. It's been a really informative event. And I also want to thank Governor O'Malley not only for joining us, but for your leadership on this issue. And I think your true legacy is the city stat and the base stat and the state stat as a global example of how to use data to inform decision making. I think we should all applaud him that he has left this true legacy that I think informs how mayors and governors need to operate on that issue. So
thank you. Thanks a lot.
But
Tell me your full name so I can send you a Christmas card.
Greg Carlock.
Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, I'll leave my name with Nate and Dr. Dinor. But in that vein, in climate implementation, especially internationally, it can be difficult to convince politicians to take on that political risk, to expose yourself to that data transparency, to those commitments. So I really wanted you to speak to, if you could speak to these types of international municipal leaders, executives, on why it's worth the political risk to expose yourself to make these commitments as a former executive, as a former mayor, as a governor, why it's worth it for the future. Thank you.
Okay. Politicians for a long time, traditionally, and I'm speaking mostly with an American perspective, albeit, the smart people in politics that advise elected officials will tell these men and women who are mayors or governors that it's really foolish and really naive to declare a goal with a date. And these people told me that when I was elected mayor of the most violent, addicted, and abandoned city in America. And they said, I said, well, why shouldn't we set a goal of reducing crime and having a date, or closing down open-air drug markets, the first 10 by this date? They said, well, what happens if you don't hit it? I said, well, what happens if we do? They said, yeah, but what happens if you don't? I said, well, what happens if we do? And one early example of that was we had 63 recommendations from our transition committee, which was a Cecil B. DeMille's cast of thousands. And I said, well, we got to publish them. We got to put them online. We got to let everybody know what the 63 are and that we're going to accomplish these. Here's the ones, 63 that should be accomplished in the next 100 days. Oh, God, don't do that. What if we don't hit them? So we ended up missing 4 of them. And you know what ones the newspaper wrote about? Those 4. But had they not had that threat of writing about those 4 not been there, we wouldn't have gotten the other 59 done. So mayors tend not to have a situational advantage that comes from knowing everything and hoarding the information, or knowing it 6 months before their public does, because it's all very visible stuff, right? I mean, either the alley's dirtier or it's cleaner. And no amount of your talking is going to convince me that it's dirtier or cleaner. I can see it. Same way, if you say you're going to reduce open-air drug markets and there's 2 guys on my grandmother's corner where there used to be 20, well, hey, that's a measurable result. And if there's 20 where there's 2, no excuses, right? So I think that the mayors actually of this world have the ability to pull the nations forward on this issue of not only climate, but also of good governance. Because if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, or the pillars of them anyway, right? It's improved prosperity, environmental protection, but one of those is also good governance. And you cannot achieve a sustainable future without also having good governance. And I believe that in any nation, in this movement forward to better governance and a more sustainable, prosperous, safer, healthier future, that while those nations might be the chariot, that chariot is pulled forward by their cities. 82% of people in Latin America live in cities. And those cities are the places where the trust is greater because the deliverables are more visible. And it's also the places where mayors don't have that phobia of feeling like the public's going to know something before they do. So in conclusion, I think the way forward is that we have to create the opportunities for the cities to plug in to what will be an open world platform of performance measurement and management, and use them to pull the nation states along.
So I would like to close out with just one more brief question to our panel. So last fall, the White House launched an American Campuses Act on Climate, which the University of Maryland was a part of the signing ceremony. This is, significant in many ways. What do you think of the future role of universities in taking climate action?
Well, I'm really glad that we, signed on this initiative because, especially after the climate change agreement signed in Paris, I think it's really important that we are accountable. And even though, we weren't at the meeting, but it's still important that the university level engaging, students especially on this issue, I think is really important. I think there are just different collaborations, different initiatives to get students involved, also working, at the higher level, being involved in meetings or maybe hosting our own event like this, just engaging, that dialogue between students and professionals and officials. And I think I would hope that the vision would be that we continue this conversation after this event and keep moving forward and actually, like Mr. O'Malley said, maybe if we do put a date to these goals that we have, we can actually work towards achieving some of them. And just I would hope that would be the vision from our initiative.
Well, I think it's a great step forward. And the reason behind that is charity begins at home, and so does climate implementation. So if you're a research institution preaching that we need to implement climate, we need to do it on our own as well. So, but let me point out a barrier to that. Just a few days back on Saturday at Maryland Day, I was talking with a gentleman at the facilities management for the campus, and he was working on the solar canopy project that they have over the parking garage. And I asked him, why don't you have a mega project which can, where you can have rooftop solar on top of, all the buildings that you have on campus? He said that the first thing you would need, since all the rooftops are slate-based, you would need a mounting structure. And I'm thinking, okay, that's easy to have. I mean, there are many panels that are built on mounting racks. But then that has to be approved by the Art, Architecture, and Landscape Board for aesthetics. So I said, panels are beautiful. Why won't you like panels? He's like, are you an engineering student? I said, yeah, I used to be. I did my chemical engineering. He said, that's what's wrong with you. That's why you find it beautiful. But my point is that probably, I don't know how right this is, but even having a positive public perception towards these projects might enable us to get there. I think maybe we have Mark over here who might know more about implementing projects on campus, but I think that can be a barrier, and that needs to be resolved as well.
What's the future role of universities in climate action?
So I think it's absolutely critical. All these movements that I've talked about, none of them succeeded without having youth leadership. Youth have to be a part of any movement. And I love the history of the Prohibition Act, and I'm above 21 and I drink, I will admit this. But I really love the story of how Prohibition got through. And it was this very basic formula where they said, stop drinking yourself, get your local saloon to close down, and then advocate for a constitutional amendment. And there were 3 steps. And I think that if you think about climate change in that way, there's a set of things you have to do yourself.
You're not going to ask us to stop drinking.
No, I'm That's what's so amazing about Prohibition, though. It's a country full of people who, you know, those of us over 21, enjoy drinking, and they passed a constitutional amendment banning it. Like, that's a movement to study, right? Like that's incredible. That seems a lot harder than slapping solar panels on some roofs. And so I mean, I just think it's incredibly important that people, you know, do what they are advocating for. Also because every action we take today is more valuable than an action tomorrow. This is like a compound interest problem, right? Like saving $10 today is much, much better than saving $10 in 30 years. That's the reality of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so any action today, I'm a believer in no matter what. But I also believe that taking that action changes us, and it changes us into advocates, and it makes us believe what's possible, and it helps us see this future that's really beautiful, where people are, you know, running their lights and their HVAC systems and everything on the sun and the wind. And, you know, we have a deadline. We have 20 or so years. We have 20 years, and we have to change the underpinnings of the economy of this country. There's no way we were doing that without universities. So huge congratulations to the University of Maryland for joining and for showing the kind of leadership it takes to have an event like this.
Hear, hear. I want to thank Dean Orr, who's for his work nationally and internationally. A gentleman earlier, when he asked me about the renewable portfolio standard, my first thing I said to you was, well, I'm fortunate that I had the honor to serve the people of Maryland. Because of our proximity to the water and the Chesapeake Bay, we're usually a little bit ahead of the curve. And understanding precedes all action. And one of the cool things I enjoyed about the presidential race, there were many things I didn't enjoy, but one of the cool things about it was the ability to actually speak to that fearlessness and the goodness within the next generation of Americans. And when you speak to that, you kind of ignite a higher frequency, if you will, that echoes back through the cynical baby boomers who have a tendency to be trapped in the scarcity belief space that we've dragged through this world. So I think the universities are key to that, and God bless the University of Maryland for continuing to be in the vanguard of this movement towards a more sustainable and prosperous future.
Yes. Well, I believe that concludes the Climate Action 2016 Forum. Thank you all so much for being here with me and us, the University of Maryland. It's been an absolute pleasure. Good afternoon. Good evening.
Good job. Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
You're never going to let me live down that road.